here we are doing chapter 10 of Unbroken. And I'm hoping that this chapter isn't as long, and I'm probably just going to read for about 20 minutes, and I hope that's okay, whether or not I finish the chapter. The last couple days have just been too long. If you feel like it's too long, or if you feel like it's not, just email the office and let me know, info@firstucc.net, and I'll read as long as you want me to. But if you want to let me know that 20 is good or a chapter is good, either way. Chapter 10, The Stinking Six. As evening fell over Funafedi, the ground crews nursed the damaged bombers. When the holes were patched and mechanical problems repaired, the planes were fueled up and loaded with 6 500-pound bombs each, ready for a strike on Tarawa the next day. Superman, still standing where it had spun to a halt, its entire length honeycombed, wouldn't join them. It probably would never fly again. Worn out from the mission and hours spent helping at the infirmary, Louis walked to a grove of coconut trees where there were tents that served as barracks. He found his tent and flopped down on a cot near Phil. The journalists were in a tent next to theirs. At the infirmary, Stanley Pillsbury lay with his bleeding leg hanging off his cot. Nearby, the other wounded Superman crewman tried to sleep. Blackout descended and a hush fell. At about 3 a.m, Louis woke to a forlorn droning, rising and falling. It was a small plane crossing back and forth overhead. Thinking that it was a crew lost in the clouds, Louis lay there listening, hoping they'd find home. Eventually, the sound faded away. Before Louis could fall back asleep, he heard the growl of heavy aircraft engines. Then, from the north end of the atoll, came a boom. A siren began sounding, and there was distant gunfire. Then a Marine ran past the airman's tent screaming, "Air raid! Air raid!" The droning overhead hadn't been a lost American crew. It had probably been a scout plane leading Japanese bombers. Funafudi was under attack. The airmen and journalists, Louis and Phil among them, jammed their feet into their boots, bolted from the tents, and stopped, some shouting, others spinning in panic. They couldn't see any bomb shelters. From down the atoll, the explosions were coming in rapid succession, each one louder and closer. The ground shook. I looked around and said, "Holy hell, where are we going to go?" Remembered pilot Joe Deasy. The best shelter he could find was a shallow pit dug around a coconut sapling, and he plowed into it, along with most of the men near him. Herman Skeers, Deasy's radio man, leapt into a trench next to an ordnance truck, joining 5 of his crewmates. Pilot Jesse Stay jumped into another hole nearby. 3 men crawled under the ordnance truck. Another flung himself into a garbage pit. 1 man ran right off the end of the atoll, splashing into the ocean even though he didn't know how to swim. Some men, finding nowhere to go, dropped to their knees to claw foxholes in the sand with their helmets. As he dug in the dark with the bombs coming, 1 man noisily cursed the son of a bitch generals who had left the atoll without shelters. Dozens of natives crowded into a large missionary church that stood in a clearing, realizing that the white church would stand out brilliantly on the dark atoll. A Marine named Fonny Black Lad ran in and yelled at the natives to get out. When they wouldn't move, he drew his sidearm. They scattered. In the infirmary, Stanley Pillsbury lay in startled confusion. One moment he'd been sleeping, and the next the atoll was rocking with explosions. A siren was howling, and people were sprinting by, dragging patients onto stretchers and rushing them out. Then the room was empty, and Pillsbury was alone. He had apparently been forgotten. He sat up, frantic. He couldn't stand. Louie and Phil ran through the coconut grove, searching for anything that might serve as shelter. The bombs were overtaking them, making a sound that one man likened to the footfalls of a giant. Boom, 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 boom. At last, Louie and Phil spotted a native hut built on flood stilts. They dove under it, landing in a heap of more than 24 men. The bombs were now so close that the men could hear them spinning in the air. DC remembered the sound as a whir, scarce as a piercing whistle. An instant later, everything was scalding whiteness and splintering noise. The ground heaved and the air whooshed around, carrying an acrid smell. Trees blew apart. A bomb struck the tent in which Louie and Phil had been sleeping a minute before. Another burst beside a pile of men in a ditch, and something speared into the back of the man on top. He said, "This feels like it, boys," and passed out. A bomb hit the ordnance truck, sending it into the air in thousands of pieces. The remains of the truck and the men under it skimmed past Jesse Stay's head. A nose gunner heard a singeing sound as the parts of the truck flew by him. It was apparently this truck that landed on one of the tents where 2 airmen were still on their cots. Another bomb tumbled into Skeerce's trench, plopping right on top of a tail gunner. It didn't go off, but sat there, hissing. The gunner shouted, "Jesus!" It took them a moment to realize that what they'd thought was a bomb was actually a fire extinguisher. Yards away, Louie and Phil huddled. The hut shook, but still stood. The bombs moved down the atoll. Each report sounded farther away, and then the explosions stopped. A few men climbed from their shelters to help the wounded and douse fires. Louie and the others stayed where they were, knowing that the bombers would be back. Matches were struck, and cigarettes were pinched in trembling fingers. "If we're hit," one man grumbled, there'll be nothing left of us but gravy." Far away, the bombers turned. The booming began again. Someone, running by the infirmary, saw Pillsbury, hurried in, threw him on a stretcher, and carried him into a tiny cement building where the other wounded had been taken. The building was so crowded that men had been laid on shelves. It was pitch dark, and doctors were shuffling around, peering at their patients by flashlight. Pillsbury lay panting in the darkness, listening to the bombs coming, feeling claustrophobic, his mind flashing with images of bombs entombing them. With men stacked everywhere and no one speaking, he thought of a morgue. His leg hurt. He began groaning, and the doctor felt his way to him and gave him morphine. The booming was louder, and then it was over them again. Tremendous crashing. The ceiling shuddered and cement dust sifted down. Outside, it was hell on earth. Men moaned and screamed. One calling for his mother. A pilot thought the voices sounded like animals crying. Men's eardrums burst. A man died of a heart attack. Another man's arm was severed. Others sobbed, prayed, and lost control of their bowels. "I wasn't only scared, I was terrified," one airman would write to his parents. "I thought I was scared in the air, but I wasn't. It was the first time in my life I saw how close death could come." Phil felt the same. Never, even during the fight over Nauru, had he known such terror. Louis crouched beside him. As he had run through the coconut grove, he had moved only on instinct and roaring adrenaline, feeling no emotion. Now, as explosions went off around him, fear seized him. Staff Sergeant Frank Wozniak, huddled in a coral trench, wearing nothing but a helmet, untied shoes, and boxer shorts. The tonnage coming down, he later wrote, seemed like a railroad carload. The bombs sounded like someone pushing a piano down a long ramp before they hit and exploded. Big palm trees were shattered and splintered all around us. The ground would rise up in the air when a bomb exploded, and there was this terrific flash of super bright light that it made. The concussion blew pieces of coral into our hole, and we blindly groped for them and tossed them out as quick as we could find them. At intervals between a bomb falling, it sounded like church. Voices from nearby slit trenches, all chanting the Lord's Prayer together over and over again, louder when bombs hit closer. I thought I even heard some guys crying. You were afraid to look up because you felt your face might be seen from above. 2 more soldiers were killed on the 3rd pass. On the 4th pass, the Japanese hit the jackpot. 2 bombs bullseyed the gassed up, loaded B-24s parked on the runway. The first went up in a huge explosion, sending bomber parts showering all over the island. Another burst into flames. The fires set off machine gun bullets which whizzed in all directions, their tracers drawing ribbons in the air. Then the 500-pound bombs on the planes started going off. Finally, the atoll fell silent. A few of the men, shaking, stood up. As they walked among the wreckage, another B-24 blew up. The explosion accelerated by its 2,300 gallons of fuel, 3,000 pounds of bombs, and cache of 50 caliber ammunition. A co-pilot wrote that it sounded like the whole island was blowing up. With that, it was over. When dawn broke, men began creeping from their hiding places. The man who had run into the ocean waded ashore, having clung to a rock for 3 hours as the tide rose. With the morning light, the men who had cursed his generals as he had dug his foxhole discovered that those generals had been digging right next to him. Louis and Phil crawled out from beneath the hut. Phil was unscathed. Louis had only a cut on his arm. They joined a procession of exhausted, stunned men. Here's a picture of Funafuti the morning after. Funafuti was wrecked. A bomb had struck the church roof, sending the building down onto itself. But thanks to Corporal Ladd, there had been no one inside. There was a crater where Louis and Phil's tent had been. Another tent lay collapsed, a bomb standing on its nose in the middle of it. Someone tied the bomb to a truck, dragged it to the beach, and turned sharply, sending the bomb skidding into the ocean. Wozniak walked up the runway and found 6 Japanese bombs lying in a neat row. The bombs were armed by spinning as they fell, but whoever had dropped them had come in too low, not leaving the bombs enough drop space to arm themselves. The men dragged them into the ocean, too. Where the struck B-24s had been, there were deep holes ringed by decapitated coconut trees. One crater, Louis noted in his diary, was 35 feet deep and 60 feet across. Bits of bomber were sprinkled everywhere. Landing gear and seats that had seen the sunset from one side of Funafuti, greeted the sunrise from the other. All that was left of one bomber was a tail, 2 wingtips, and 2 propellers, connected by a black smudge. There was a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine sitting by itself on the runway. The plane that it belonged to was nowhere to be found. Louis came upon a reporter staring into a crater, in tears. Louis walked to him, bracing to see a dead body. Instead, he saw a typewriter flattened. The wounded and dead were everywhere. 2 mechanics who'd been caught in the open were bruised all over from the concussive force of the explosions. They were so traumatized that they couldn't talk and were using their hands to communicate. Men stood in a solemn circle around a couple of seats and twisted metal, all that was left of the ordnance truck. The 3 men who had sought shelter under it were beyond recognition. The radio man was found dead, a bomb shard in his head. Louis came upon the body of a native dressed in a loincloth, lying on his back. Half his head was missing. The radio operator would say that there had been about 14 Japanese bombers, but thinking that there had been 2 sets of 3, someone dubbed them the Stinking 6. Everyone expected them to return. Phil and Louis joined a group of men digging foxholes with shovels and helmets. When they had a moment, they walked to the beach and sat together for an hour trying to collect their thoughts. Sometime that day, Louis went to the infirmary to help out. Pillsbury was back in his cot. His leg was burning terribly, and he lay with it dangling in the air, dripping blood into a puddle on the floor. Coppernail sat with him, thanking him for shooting down that Zero. The doctor was concerned that Funafuti's foot wouldn't stop bleeding. Surgery was necessary, but there was no anesthetic, so Pillsbury was just going to have to do without. With Pillsbury gripping the bed with both hands, Louis lying over his legs, the doctor used pliers to tear tissue from Pillsbury's foot, then pulled a long strip of skin hanging over the bone stump and sewed it up. Superman sat by the airstrip, listing left on its peg-legged landing gear, the shredded tire hanging partway off. The air raid had missed the plane, but it didn't look like it. Its 594 holes were spread over every part of it. Swarms of bullet holes, slashes from shrapnel, 4 cannon fire gashes at least as large as a man's head, the gaping punch hole beside Pillsbury's turret, and the hole in the rudder as big as a doorway. The plane looked as if it had flown through barbed wire, its paint scoured off the leading edges of the engine and sides. Journalists and airmen circled it, amazed that it had stayed airborne for 5 hours with so much damage. Phil was hailed as a miracle worker, and everyone had cause to reassess the supposedly faint-hearted B-24. A photographer climbed inside the plane and snapped a picture. Taken in daylight in the dark of the plane's interior, the image showed shafts of light streaming through the holes, a shower of stars against the black sky. Louis, looking as battered as his plane, walked to Superman. He leaned his head into one of the cannon holes and saw the severed right rudder cables, still spliced together as he had left them. He ran his fingers along the tears in Superman's skin. The plane had saved him and all but one of his crew. He would think of it as a dear friend. Here he is. Louis boarded another plane and began his journey back to Hawaii with Phil, Cuppernell, Mitchell, and the bandaged Glassman. Pillsbury, Lambert, and Douglas were too badly wounded to join the crew. In a few days, they'd be sent to Samoa, where a doctor would take one look at Pillsbury's leg and announce that it had been hamburgered. Lambert would be hospitalized for 5 months. When a general presented him with a Purple Heart, Lambert apparently couldn't sit up, so the general pinned the medal to the sheet. Douglas's war was done. Brooks was lying in a grave in Funafuti's Marine Corps Cemetery. There's a footnote here. Lambert eventually returned to duty with another crew and amassed an astounding record, completing at least 95 missions. Whoops. Lost my page there. Okay, and here's a picture of Louis looking through that cannon hole. The crew was broken up forever. They would never see Superman again. An oppressive weight settled on Louis as he flew away from Funafuti. He and the remains of the crew stopped at Canton, then flew on to Palmyra Atoll, where Louis took a hot shower and watched They Died with Their Boots On at the base theater. It was the movie he'd been working on as an extra when the war had begun, a lifetime ago. Back on Hawaii, he sank into a cold torpor. He was irritable and withdrawn. Phil, too, was off kilter, drinking a few too many, seeming not himself. With a gutted crew and no plane, the men weren't called for assignments, so they killed time in Honolulu. When a drunken hothead tried to pick a fight, Phil stared back indifferently, but Louis obliged. The two stomped outside to have it out, and the hothead backed out. Later, drinking beer with friends, Louis couldn't bring himself to be sociable. He holed up in his room, listening to music. His only other solace was running, slogging through the sand around the Kahuku runway, thinking of the 1944 Olympics, trying to forget Harry Brooks' plaintive face. On May 24th, Louis, Phil, and the other Superman veterans were transferred to the 42nd Squadron of the 11th Bomb Group. The 42nd would be stationed on the eastern edge of Oahu on the gorgeous beach of Kualoa. 6 new men were brought in to replace the lost Superman crewmen. Flying with unfamiliar men worried Louis and Phil. "Don't like the idea a bit," Louis once wrote in his diary. "Every time they mix up a crew, they have a crack-up." Among the Superman veterans, the only thing that seemed noteworthy about the new men was their tail gunner, a sergeant from Cleveland named Francis McNamara. Had such an affinity for sweets that he ate practically nothing but dessert. The men called him Mac. For the moment, they had no plane. Liberators destined for the 11th Bomb Group were being flown in from other combat areas, and the first 5, peppered with bullet holes, had just arrived. One of them, Green Hornet, looked haggard, its sides splattered with something black, the paint worn off the engines. Even with an empty bomb bay and all 4 engines going, it was only just able to stay airborne. It tended to fly with its tail dragging below its nose, something the airmen called mushing, a reference to the mushy feel of the controls of a faltering plane. Engineers went over the bomber, but found no explanation. All of the airmen were wary of Green Hornet. The bomber was relegated to errands, and the ground crewmen began prying parts off it for use on other planes. Louis went up in it for a short hop, came away referring to it as the craziest plane and hoped he'd never have to fly in it again. On May 26th, Louis packed up his belongings and caught a ride to his new Kualoa digs, a private cottage 30 feet from the ocean. Louis, Phil, Mitchell, and Cuppernell would have the place all to themselves. That afternoon, Louis stayed in, transforming the garage into his private room. Louis went to a squadron meeting where he met a rookie pilot, George Smitty Smith, by coincidence a close friend of Cece's. After the meeting, Phil lingered late with Smitty, talking about Cece. At the cottage, Louis turned in. The next day, he, Phil, and Cuppernell were going to go to Honolulu to take another crack at P.Y. Chong's steaks. Along the island at Hickam Field, 9 crewmen and 1 passenger climbed aboard a B-24. The crew, piloted by a Tennessean named Clarence Corpening, had just come from San Francisco and was on its way to Canton, then Australia. As men on the ground watched, the plane lifted off, banked south, and flew out of sight. That is the end of that chapter, and that was 26 minutes. Chapter 11, Nobody's Going to Live Through This. Holy cow. Scary stuff. Really scary stuff. Let's say our prayers. Holy God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for this day. We ask that you would be with us as we sleep. Keep us safe as the rain finishes up, and that we rest well as it gets dark. We ask that you would wake us with health and that we would be able to do your work in the following day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I hope you sleep well.